The rusty key turned with a grinding sound that echoed through the stone chamber. Rowan held his breath as the heavy shackles fell away from Emma's wrists with a metallic clang that seemed to shake the very walls around them. He had spent 3 months planning this rescue. 3 months of sleepless nights sketching guard rotations, of careful observation from the shadows of the marketplace, of bribing stable boys for information about which cells held which prisoners. He had memorized every stone of the outer walls, every creak of the wooden stairs, every pattern of torchlight that swept across the courtyard at night. The hardest part had been getting close enough to see her. Blackwood's dungeon was buried deep beneath the castle, accessible only through a maze of corridors that required passing at least 6 different guard posts. But Rowan had patience, the same methodical patience that made him such a skilled mapmaker. He had posed as a merchant, a traveling scholar, even a distant cousin of one of Blackwood's minor officials, anything to gain access to different parts of the castle and piece together the layout. It was during one of these reconnaissance missions that he had finally caught sight of Emma being led to the courtyard for her daily exercise. 10 minutes of sunlight while chained to a post like an animal. Even then, even filthy and exhausted, she had held herself with a dignity that made Rowan's chest ache. All for this moment, to free the woman who had been captured trying to protect her village from Blackwood's tax collectors. Emma rubbed her wrists where the iron had left deep red marks, wincing slightly as her fingers traced the raw, abraded skin. The shackles had been too small for her, clearly made for someone with more delicate bones, and they had cut into her flesh with every movement. Her long brown hair, which Rowan remembered seeing gleaming like polished wood in the marketplace months ago, now hung in tangled waves around her face, matted with grime and smelling of the moldy straw that served as her only bedding. Her simple dress, once a cheerful blue that had reminded him of summer skies, was now torn and dirty from weeks of imprisonment, stained with things he didn't want to think about. But her green eyes, those eyes still held a fire that all of Blackwood's cruelty hadn't been able to extinguish. They were the same eyes that had blazed with defiance when she'd stood in the town square, refusing to pay taxes on land that had been in her family for generations. The same eyes that had never once looked away when Blackwood's men had jeered at her, calling her names that would have made other women weep. Even now, after everything, they held that unmistakable spark of someone who refused to be broken. "Come on," Rowan whispered urgently, grabbing her arm gently. He could feel how thin she'd become, could count the bones beneath her skin. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the next guard check. There's a tunnel that leads to the river. I have a boat waiting there, supplies, warm clothes." He had packed everything carefully. A thick woolen cloak that had belonged to his mother, dried meat and bread that would keep them fed for days, even a small pot of healing salve for her wounded wrists. But Emma didn't move. Instead, she looked down at the broken shackles at her feet. The twisted metal that had held her captive for so long now seemed insignificant, just pieces of iron that could never hurt her again. Then she looked back up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was something in her face that wasn't quite surprise, wasn't quite relief. It was more like recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment, had been waiting for it. And then she smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made his stomach flip and his carefully planned escape route suddenly feel less important than understanding what that expression meant. "You just took responsibility for me?" she said softly. Rowan stared at her. "What? No, I'm rescuing you. You're free now. You can go wherever you want." Emma's smile widened. "Can I? You broke my chains, Rowan. In my village, that means you're responsible for what I do with my freedom. It's an old law, but it's still binding." "That's ridiculous," Rowan said, though his voice came out more uncertain than he'd intended. "I've never heard of such a law." "You wouldn't have. You're not from the mountain villages." Emma stepped closer to him, and he caught the faint scent of wildflowers that somehow still clung to her despite everything she'd been through. "But I am. And now you are too, by the ancient code." Rowan's mind raced. He had planned for guards, for locked doors, for sword fights and dramatic escapes. He had not planned for this, whatever this was. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you think this means, but I just wanted to help. You were innocent. Blackwood had no right to imprison you. And I'm grateful, Emma said. But gratitude doesn't change the law. You freed me. That makes you responsible for me until I can stand on my own again. You seem to be standing just fine, Rowan pointed out. Emma laughed, a sound like silver bells that seemed oddly out of place in the grim dungeon. Standing, yes, but I have no money, no home. Blackwood burned my cottage when I refused to pay his impossible taxes. No family left alive. No skills except farming land I no longer own. Her green eyes met his steadily. So tell me, rescuer, what exactly am I supposed to do with this freedom you've given me? Rowan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He hadn't thought that far ahead. In all his planning, he had somehow assumed that freeing Emma would be the end of the story, that she would thank him, maybe give him a grateful kiss, and then, well, then she would disappear into whatever life she chose to build. I didn't think about that, he admitted. Of course you didn't. Heroes rarely do. Emma picked up the broken shackles and hefted them in her hands. These chains kept me in one place, but at least I knew where I stood. Now I'm free to starve anywhere I choose. A shout echoed from somewhere above them, followed by the sound of running feet. Rowan's blood turned to ice. They've discovered you're gone, he said. We have to move. Now. But Emma still didn't budge. Where are we going? I told you, there's a boat. And after the boat? What then? Where do I go? What do I do? Emma's voice was patient, but there was an edge to it now. You can't just free someone and walk away, Rowan. Freedom without purpose is just another kind of prison. More shouts, closer now. Rowan could hear individual voices, the clank of armor and weapons. In minutes, maybe less, this chamber would be full of Blackwood's men. Fine, he said desperately. Come with me. To my village. We'll figure it out from there. Emma's smile returned, softer this time. Now you're beginning to understand. She moved then, quick and graceful despite her weeks of confinement. Together they ran through the narrow stone corridors, following the route Rowan had memorized. Behind them, the shouts grew louder and more urgent. The tunnel to the river was hidden behind a loose stone in the dungeon's lowest level. Rowan had discovered it weeks ago, during his careful scouting of the fortress. It had probably been an escape route for the castle's original builders, long forgotten by the current occupants. They squeezed through the narrow opening just as torchlight began to flicker at the far end of the corridor they'd left behind. The tunnel was pitch black and barely wide enough for one person. Rowan led the way, feeling along the damp stone walls, with Emma close behind him. How did you know about this place? Emma whispered as they crawled through the darkness. I've been watching the castle for months, Rowan replied. I'm a cartographer. I make maps. I notice things like old tunnels and hidden passages. A cartographer, Emma repeated thoughtfully. That's a useful skill. Sometimes. The tunnels seem to go on forever, each step taking them deeper into the earth beneath the castle. Rowan's muscles ached from the awkward crawling position, and he could hear Emma's labored breathing behind him. Weeks of imprisonment and poor food had weakened her more than she was letting on. But finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Rowan saw a faint glimmer of moonlight ahead. They emerged behind a curtain of hanging moss on the riverbank, gasping the cool night air like drowning people breaking the surface of water. The contrast was almost overwhelming after the stifling closeness of the tunnel. The vast openness of the night sky, the fresh smell of the river, the gentle sound of water moving over stones. Rowan's small boat was exactly where he'd left it, tied to a fallen log and hidden among the reeds. It wasn't much to look at. A simple fishing boat he'd bought from an old man in the next village, but it was sturdy and silent, and he'd spent hours learning to handle it properly in preparation for this night. They pushed off into the current without speaking, letting the river carry them away from Blackwood's fortress. The current was stronger than Rowan had expected, and for several tense minutes he struggled to keep the boat moving in the right direction while staying close enough to the shore to remain hidden in the shadows. Emma sat perfectly still, seeming to understand instinctively that any sudden movement might tip their precarious balance. Only when the castle's towers had disappeared behind the trees, When the last glow of torchlight had faded from view, did Emma finally break the silence. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly across the water. "So," she said, settling back against the boat's wooden sides with visible relief, "tell me about this village of yours. What's it like? Will I be safe there?" Rowan guided the boat around a bend in the river before answering. "It's called Millbrook. About 50 families, mostly farmers and craftsmen. My house is small, but it's comfortable. There's a workshop where I draw my maps." "And your family?" "My parents died of fever 3 winters ago. I have a sister, but she married a merchant from the capital. I don't see her much." Emma nodded. "So you live alone?" "Yes." Rowan glanced at her. "Is that a problem?" "Only if you think it is." Emma trailed her fingers in the dark water. "I'm used to taking care of myself, but I'm also used to having work to do. I can't just sit in your house eating your food and doing nothing." "What kind of work did you do before?" "I grew herbs and made remedies. People came from villages all around when they were sick or hurt." Emma's voice grew sad. "I had the best healing garden in 3 counties. Took me years to develop some of those plants." Rowan thought about this as they drifted downstream. "Could you start over? Grow a new garden?" "It would take time, and I'd need land and seeds and tools." Emma looked at him seriously. "It would take a partner, someone willing to invest in a venture that might not pay off for years." The word partner hung in the air between them. Rowan found himself studying Emma's profile in the moonlight, the strong line of her jaw, the way her hair caught the silver light. "Why did you really come for me?" Emma asked suddenly. The question caught Rowan off guard. "What do you mean?" "You could have petitioned the king, or gathered the other villages to oppose Blackwood legally. You could have done a dozen things that didn't involve sneaking into a dungeon in the middle of the night." Emma turned to face him fully. "So why this way? Why risk your life for someone you'd never even met?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, steering the boat around another bend. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw them bring you in," he said. "I was delivering maps to one of Blackwood's clerks when the soldiers dragged you through the courtyard. You were fighting them every step of the way, but not with anger. With dignity. Like you refused to let them break your spirit." He paused, remembering that day 3 months ago. "And when they threw you down in front of Blackwood, and he demanded you pay taxes on land that wasn't even yours anymore, you looked him straight in the eye and said no. Just no. Not 'I can't' or 'please have mercy.' Just no." Rowan met her gaze. "I'd never seen anyone stand up to him like that." Emma was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "You know what I think? I think you didn't rescue me at all. I think you rescued yourself." "What do you mean?" "You've been living alone, making your maps, keeping your head down, safe but not really living. When you saw me refuse to bow to Blackwood, it reminded you that there are things worth fighting for." Emma smiled. "So you created a quest for yourself, a reason to be brave." Rowan wanted to argue, but something in her words rang true. He had been living safely, quietly, making his maps and bothering no one. When had he last taken a real risk? When had he last done something that mattered? "Maybe," he admitted. "But I still think the ancient law thing is something you made up." Emma's laugh echoed across the water. "Maybe it is. Or maybe it isn't. Does it matter? I guess not." They traveled through the night, taking turns rowing and resting. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached the landing near Millbrook. Rowan's village was small and peaceful, with neat houses and gardens arranged along the river's edge. "It's pretty," Emma said as they tied up the boat. "It's home," Rowan replied. He shouldered his pack and helped Emma onto the dock. "Come on. I'll make us some breakfast, and then we can figure out what comes next." But as they walked up the path toward his house, Rowan realized he was no longer thinking about this as a temporary situation. Somewhere between the dungeon and the riverbank, something had shifted in his mind. Emma was right. By freeing her, he had taken responsibility for her. But more than that, he had taken responsibility for his own life in a way he hadn't in years. His house was exactly as he'd left it, small but well-built, with a stone chimney and windows that looked out over the river. Inside, it was neat and comfortable, with his drafting table in one corner and shelves lined with his completed maps. Emma walked around the main room, taking everything in. She stopped at his drafting table where his current project, a detailed map of the northern trade routes, lay half-finished. "This is beautiful work," she said, tracing one of the mountain ranges with her finger. "Thank you." Rowan started a fire in the hearth and put water on to boil. "Are you hungry?" "Starving," Emma admitted. Prison food isn't exactly hearty. As Rowan prepared breakfast, Emma continued exploring his house. She examined his maps, his books, the small herb garden he kept outside his kitchen window. "You know," she said, coming back inside, "you already have a good start on medicinal plants out there. With a little expansion, we could have a proper healing garden within a year." "We?" Rowan asked, though his heart jumped at the word. Emma met his eyes across the room. "Well, you did take responsibility for me, and I take my obligations seriously." "What obligations?" "To make sure the person who freed me doesn't regret it." Emma sat down at his small table. "I won't be a burden, Rowan. I'll earn my place here." "I never said you were a burden. You didn't have to. I can see it in your face. You're wondering what you've gotten yourself into." Emma's expression grew serious. "I'll make you a deal. Give me 6 months. Let me establish a healing practice here. Contribute to the village. If at the end of that time you want me to leave, I'll go. No arguments, no ancient laws." Rowan set a bowl of porridge and honey in front of her, then sat down across the table. "And if I don't want you to leave?" Emma's smile was warm and genuine. "Then we'll see what kind of partnership we can build." Over the following weeks, Emma proved true to her word. She threw herself into establishing her place in Millbrook with an energy that amazed Rowan. She expanded his small herb garden, traded her knowledge of healing for supplies and materials, and quickly became indispensable to the village. When old Henrik's arthritis flared up, Emma's willow bark tea had him back in his fields in days. When the baker's daughter developed a persistent cough, Emma's honey and thyme mixture cleared it up completely. Word spread to neighboring villages, and soon people were traveling for miles to seek Emma's help. But it wasn't just her healing abilities that impressed Rowan. Emma had a way of seeing possibilities he'd never noticed. She suggested improvements to his maps based on her knowledge of mountain paths. She negotiated better prices for his work by pointing out details that made his maps more valuable than his competitors. "You undervalue yourself," she told him one evening as they worked together in the garden. "Your maps aren't just drawings. They're tools that help people navigate safely through dangerous places. That's worth more than you're charging." "I don't like haggling over prices," Rowan admitted. "That's why you need a partner who does." Emma grinned at him. "I spent years negotiating with tax collectors and village councils. I know how to get fair value for good work." Within 2 months, Rowan's income had doubled. Emma's healing practice was bringing in steady money as well, and together they were more prosperous than either had been alone. But prosperity wasn't the only thing growing between them. Rowan found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the way Emma's eyes lit up when she talked about a particularly interesting patient, to the comfortable silence they shared while working in the garden together. One evening in late summer, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the river gold, Emma brought up the approaching end of their 6-month agreement. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said quietly. Rowan's stomach clenched. "Do we? The 6 months will be up soon. I promised you could ask me to leave if you wanted. And I promised to consider it fairly." Rowan turned to face her. "I have considered it." Emma waited, her green eyes steady on his face. "I don't want you to leave," Rowan said simply. "I don't think I could stand it if you left." Emma's smile was radiant. "Good, because I wasn't planning to go anywhere. Even if I hadn't asked you to stay, especially then, I would have had to convince you that you needed me." Emma reached over and took his hand. "Though I admit this way is easier." Rowan laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "So what now? Do we make this official somehow?" "We could," Emma said thoughtfully. Though I should probably tell you something first. What? Emma's eyes sparkled with mischief. That ancient law about taking responsibility for someone whose chains you break? I may have exaggerated its importance just a little. Rowan stared at her. You mean you made it up? Not entirely. There is such a custom in the mountain villages. But it's more of a guideline than a law. And it usually only applies to family members or close friends. So you manipulated me. I encouraged you to think through the consequences of your actions, Emma corrected. There's a difference. Rowan shook his head, but he was smiling. You're impossible. I'm practical. If you had just rescued me and left me to figure things out on my own, where would either of us be now? Emma squeezed his hand. You'd still be alone in this house, undercharging for your beautiful maps. And well, I'd probably be in some other village, struggling to start over with nothing. Instead, we're here. Together, building something neither of us could have built alone. Rowan brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. I love you, he said. I should have said it weeks ago. I love you too, Emma replied. And I should have told you the truth about the ancient law weeks ago. Why didn't you? Emma was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Because I was afraid. I'd lost everything. My home, my garden, my independence. When you freed me, I had nothing left but my pride. And even that was pretty battered. She turned to face him fully. The law gave me a reason to stay that didn't make me feel like a charity case. It let me believe I was here because of duty and tradition, not because I was desperate and had nowhere else to go. But that changed. That changed, Emma agreed. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing a reason to stay and started wanting to stay. The ancient law became irrelevant. Rowan pulled her closer, and she settled against his side with a contented sigh. So, he said, if we're being completely honest with each other, I should probably admit something too. What? I knew you were making up the ancient law thing. Emma sat up and stared at him. You did not. I did. I'm a cartographer. Remember? I've studied the customs of dozens of different regions. I'd never heard of anything like what you described. Then why didn't you call me on it? Rowan grinned. Because I liked the idea that you wanted to stay. And I was afraid that if I challenged your excuse, you might decide you didn't need one after all. Emma laughed and swatted his arm. So we were both manipulating each other. Apparently. Good, Emma said, settling back against his side. That probably means we're well matched. As the stars began to appear overhead, Rowan reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. He had set out to rescue someone he thought needed saving, only to discover that he was the one who needed rescuing. He had broken Emma's chains, but in doing so, he had also broken free from the quiet, safe prison he had built around his own life. Emma, he said softly. Mmm. Thank you. For what? For letting me take responsibility for you. It was the best mistake I ever made. Emma tilted her head up to look at him, her green eyes bright with starlight. It wasn't a mistake, Rowan. It was a choice. The first real choice either of us had made in a long time. She was right, Rowan realized. Breaking Emma's chains had been more than a rescue. It had been a declaration. A decision to stop hiding from life and start engaging with it, messily and dangerously and beautifully. I have another confession, Emma said sleepily. What now? I knew you knew I was making it up. Rowan laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful village. How? You're too smart not to have figured it out. But you played along anyway, which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man you are. What kind is that? Emma smiled against his shoulder. The kind worth staying for. As they sat together under the star-filled sky, Rowan thought about chains, the ones that bind us, and the ones we choose to break. Some chains are made of iron, forged by others to keep us trapped. But the strongest chains are often the ones we forge ourselves, out of fear and habit and the safety of staying small. He had broken Emma's physical chains, but she had done something far more important. She had shown him how to break the invisible chains that had kept him from really living. Tomorrow, they would continue building their life together. Emma would tend to her patients and expand her garden. Rowan would work on his maps and perhaps explore some of those new possibilities Emma was always seeing. But tonight, they were simply here, together, free in all the ways that mattered most. "Rowan," Emma murmured. "Yes. Next time you want to rescue someone, maybe discuss it with me first. I might have some ideas about strategy." Rowan smiled in the darkness. "Deal. Though I think you're the only person I'll ever need to rescue." "Good," Emma said, "because you're the only person I'll ever let take responsibility for me." And as they sat together under the stars, both of them understood that sometimes the most important freedom isn't the freedom to run away. It's the freedom to choose to stay. 2 years later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of what had once been Rowan's small house, and was now unmistakably their home. Emma stood at the kitchen window, grinding dried willow bark with practiced efficiency, while keeping one eye on the garden that had grown far beyond anything Rowan could have imagined 2 years ago. What had started as his modest herb patch now sprawled across nearly half an acre, with carefully planned sections for medicinal plants, culinary herbs, and the experimental hybrids Emma had been developing. Neat rows of lavender-bordered pathways lined with healing mint, while towering sunflowers marked the boundaries where her more dangerous plants, wolfsbane, foxglove, deadly nightshade, were kept safely away from curious children and wandering livestock. "The Henderson boy is here again," Emma called over her shoulder to Rowan, who was bent over his drafting table, putting the finishing touches on a commission from the capital's Royal Survey Office. "Third time this week." Rowan looked up from his map, following Emma's gaze to where young Tom Henderson lurked at the edge of their property, clearly working up the courage to approach the house. The 15-year-old had been finding excuses to visit ever since Emma had treated his broken arm the previous summer, and his reasons were becoming increasingly transparent. "Maybe he's actually sick this time," Rowan suggested with barely concealed amusement. "Lovesick, more likely." Emma's tone was fond rather than annoyed. "Though I suppose that's a real enough ailment." Their life had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Emma's reputation as a healer had spread far beyond Millbrook, bringing a steady stream of patients from villages sometimes days away. Rowan's maps were now sought after by merchants, explorers, and government officials who had learned that his attention to detail could mean the difference between a successful journey and a dangerous mistake. But more than professional success, they had found something neither had expected. A partnership that made them both stronger than they had ever been alone. The front door opened without a knock, and Lucy Miller burst in with the familiarity of someone who had been doing so for months. Emma's apprentice was 17, sharp-minded, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever she was most needed. "Emma, we have a problem," Lucy announced, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "There's a messenger from the capital at the inn. He's been asking questions about you. Specifically about someone matching your description who might have escaped from Lord Blackwood's prison 2 years ago." The grinding bowl slipped from Emma's hands, shattering on the stone floor in a crash that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent house. Rowan was on his feet instantly, his chair scraping across the wooden planks. "What kind of questions?" Emma asked, her voice carefully controlled. "The dangerous kind," Lucy replied grimly. "He's offering gold for information about any woman with brown hair and green eyes who appeared in this area around the time of your arrival. He's been very careful not to mention Blackwood by name, but he doesn't need to." Rowan's mind raced through possibilities, plans, escape routes. 2 years of peace had perhaps made them too comfortable, too visible. Emma's success as a healer meant half the region knew her face, her name, her story, or at least the version of her story they had carefully crafted. "How much does he know?" Rowan asked. "Enough to be dangerous, not enough to be certain," Lucy said. "But he's not stupid, and he's definitely not giving up. I overheard him telling the innkeeper he plans to visit every healer and wise woman within 50 miles. Emma moved to the window, peering out at the garden that had become her sanctuary, her life's work rebuilt from nothing. Rowan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. "We could leave," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "I have maps of the Northern Territories. We could be gone before nightfall." Emma was quiet for so long that Rowan began to mentally catalog what they would need to pack, which routes would be safest, how quickly they could liquidate their assets. Then she turned to face him, and he saw something in her expression that reminded him of the woman who had stood up to Blackwood in his own courtyard. "No," she said firmly. "We're not running. Emma, I ran once before, Rowan. Well, I was dragged away, but the result was the same. I lost everything. My home, my garden, my life's work. I won't do it again." Lucy shifted uncomfortably near the door. "Not to interrupt, but what exactly are we talking about here? Because if there's something I should know about your past—" "Sit down," Emma said, gesturing to the chairs around the small table. "Both of you, it's time I told you the whole truth." As they settled around the table, Emma began to speak, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "My name isn't Emma Miller," she began. "It's Emma Thornwick. 2 years ago, I was imprisoned by Lord Blackwood for refusing to pay taxes on land that had been stolen from my family. What I never told anyone, what I never told you, Rowan, is that I wasn't just some village healer who got caught up in Blackwood's greed." She paused, meeting Rowan's eyes directly. "I was the leader of a network of healers and herbalists who had been quietly undermining Blackwood's rule for months. We treated people who couldn't afford his physicians. We provided remedies to villages whose crops had been seized. And yes, we occasionally helped people disappear when Blackwood's attention became too dangerous." Rowan stared at her, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. "That's why you were so calm in the dungeon. Why you seemed to be expecting rescue." "I wasn't expecting rescue," Emma corrected. "I was expecting execution. Blackwood had finally gathered enough evidence to prove I was more than just a tax evader. He was planning to make an example of me." She smiled ruefully. "Your timing was fortuitous." Lucy leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement rather than fear. "So you're saying you were some kind of rebel leader?" "I'm saying I was someone who refused to watch people suffer when I had the skills to help them." Emma's voice grew stronger. "And I'm saying that if Blackwood is still looking for me after 2 years, it's not because he's interested in justice. It's because he's afraid." "Afraid of what?" Rowan asked. "Afraid that I'll do it again. Afraid that I'll inspire others to do it. Afraid that people will remember there are alternatives to bowing down and accepting whatever scraps of mercy he chooses to offer." Emma stood and moved to a cabinet that Rowan had always assumed contained her medical supplies. Instead, she pulled out a leather-bound journal and several small canvas bags that clinked with the sound of coins. "I've been preparing for this day since we arrived in Millbrook," she said, setting the items on the table. "This journal contains detailed records of Blackwood's illegal activities, tax records, land seizures, documented cases of abuse of power, and these," she gestured to the bags, "contain enough gold to fund a legal challenge to his authority." Rowan picked up the journal, flipping through pages of meticulous notes written in Emma's careful handwriting. Names, dates, locations, a comprehensive catalog of corruption and cruelty. "Where did you get all this?" he asked. "Some of it I gathered before my arrest. The rest, well, information has a way of finding its way to people who know how to use it." Emma's smile was enigmatic. "Did you really think all those patients who traveled so far to see me were only interested in my healing skills? You've been building another network," Rowan realized. "Here, in Millbrook. Not just in Millbrook. In every village where I've treated patients, every community where word of my work has spread." Emma's eyes blazed with the same fire he remembered from their first night together. "Blackwood may have destroyed my first garden, but he couldn't destroy the seeds I planted in people's minds." Lucy was grinning now, her earlier worry transformed into admiration. "This is incredible. You're not just a healer, you're a revolutionary." "I'm someone who refuses to accept that things have to stay the way they are," Emma corrected. "And if Blackwood's messenger is here, It means he's finally realized that his problem hasn't gone away. It's grown. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. All three froze, but then Tom Henderson's voice called out, tentative and worried. "Miss Emma? Are you all right? I heard something break." Emma laughed, the sound releasing some of the tension in the room. "Come in, Tom. We're fine." The young man entered, his eyes immediately going to the broken grinding bowl on the floor. "I can clean that up for you," he offered eagerly. "That's sweet of you, but unnecessary." Emma studied his face carefully. "Tom, have you spoken to any strangers today? Anyone asking questions about me or about people in the village?" Tom's expression grew serious. "There was a man at the inn, well-dressed, city clothes. He asked me if I knew any healers in the area." The boy straightened his shoulders. "I told him I'd never heard of any." Emma and Rowan exchanged glances. The loyalty they had earned in Millbrook might be their greatest protection. "Good boy," Emma said gently. "If anyone else asks, you've never heard of me. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am. But are you in trouble?" "Not the kind you need to worry about," Emma assured him. "But it would be helpful if you could let people know that strangers have been asking questions. Quietly, you understand." Tom nodded eagerly and hurried out, clearly thrilled to be trusted with what he undoubtedly saw as a secret mission. "So," Rowan said once they were alone again, "what's the plan? Because I assume you have one." Emma's smile was radiant and terrifying in equal measure. "We're going to give Blackwood exactly what he's afraid of. We're going to remind people that they don't have to live in fear." She moved to another cabinet and pulled out a stack of papers that Rowan recognized as copies of his own maps, but marked with symbols and notations he had never seen before. Every village marked on these maps has at least one person who's ready to stand up to Blackwood. Every safe house, every hidden route, every ally we've cultivated over the past 2 years. Emma spread the maps across the table. "Blackwood sent one messenger to find me. I can have 100 messengers spreading word of his corruption within a week." "That's incredibly dangerous," Rowan said, though he could feel excitement building alongside his fear. "So is doing nothing." Emma met his eyes steadily. "I won't run, Rowan. I won't hide. And I won't let Blackwood terrorize people who are only guilty of showing me kindness." Lucy was studying the maps with professional interest. "You'll need someone who knows the local area intimately. Someone who can identify the fastest, safest routes between villages." "I'll need a map maker," Emma agreed, looking at Rowan. "Someone I trust completely. Someone who's already proven he's willing to take risks for the right cause." Rowan looked at the woman he loved, at the evidence of the careful, dangerous work she had been doing right under his nose for 2 years. Part of him wanted to bundle her into a cart and disappear into the northern wilderness where they could live quietly and safely forever. But a larger part of him, the part that had spent 3 months planning a rescue, that had crawled through pitch-black tunnels and faced armed guards for a woman he barely knew, recognized the truth in her words. They had built something beautiful here, something worth protecting. And sometimes the only way to protect something was to fight for it. "When do we start?" he asked. Emma's answering smile was brilliant. "We already have." The moment Blackwood's messenger started asking questions, he declared war on everything we've built. Now we finish what we started. Outside, Tom Henderson was already making his rounds, spreading word with the enthusiasm of youth and the discretion Emma had taught him. By evening, every family in Millbrook would know to be cautious of strangers asking questions. And by morning, riders would be leaving the village with messages that would travel far faster than any of Blackwood's agents could follow, carrying news that would spread like wildfire through communities that had been waiting 2 years for a signal that the fight was not over. In her kitchen, surrounded by broken pottery and secret maps, Emma Thornwick began planning the campaign that would either free her forever or destroy everything she had built. But as she looked at Rowan's determined face and Lucy's eager expression, she realized she was no longer fighting alone. The chains Rowan had broken 2 years ago had been made of iron, but the bonds they had forged since then were made of something far stronger. "So," Lucy said, rolling up her sleeves with obvious relish, "where do we begin?" Emma looked out at her garden, at the village that had become home, at the life she had built from nothing and refused to lose again. "We begin," she said, "by reminding Lord Blackwood that some things, once planted, are impossible to root out completely. The war for Millbrook, and for everyone like it, was about to begin.